1846, Governor Fitzroy of New South Wales suggested that there should be some type of communication between the various colonies. At that stage, there were only 3 colonies. There was New South Wales, Tasmania, and South Australia, right? 2 years later, the British Parliament passed an Act of Parliament which enacted the Colonial Government Authority, which gave the colonies the ability to effectively look at the question of unification, not in terms of land unification, but in terms of unification regarding things like customs and duties. Because the colonies were separate and they had their own customs and duties, their own immigration acts, etc., etc. In 1851, Victoria was declared an independent colony from New South Wales. In 1857, we saw in 1855, something extraordinary. In 1856, something extraordinary happened. The British Parliament passed legislation which allowed the colonies to act independently of the British Parliament. To a significant degree, this was due to 2 things. One, the revolts in Upper and Lower Canada in the 1830s and 1840s, and the Eureka Rebellion in 1854, where the British Parliament realised in order to keep its colonies, it had to give them some type of autonomy. This is what, with the introduction of universal male suffrage, right? Now, in 1857, the premiers of the three of the colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, and Hobart, met at the first Premiers' Conference to discuss trying to rationalise things in terms of customs and duties, the practical things. Because if you went from Victoria to New South Wales, you had to pay customs. If you wanted to export stuff from Victoria to New South Wales to Victoria, you had to pay customs. And obviously, it was a big deal for people along the Murray. They had to pay excise, customs. Those of you who are old enough to remember will remember when you caught a train from Sydney, you get to Albury, you get off the train and you get on another train because the states had different rail gauges because they're independent colonies. Okay? So, now a few other things happened. In 1859, Queensland was separated from New South Wales. So you had another colony. And by that time, West Australia had been established. So by this time, you had 6 colonies. Now, in 1870, the British removed all their troops from Australia. Convicts had actually had stopped coming to West Australia, which was the last state which accepted colonies, convicts in 1865. So the British Parliament basically allowed the colonies to be self-governing to an extent. Now, when you've got self-government colonies, you had an issue. You had 3 major issues. You had the issue of immigration, because they had fixed borders. You had the issue of customs and excise. And you had the issue of defence, because by the 1870s and 1880s, the French and the Germans were colonising the Pacific. You had the French colonising Tahiti, Noumea, and the Germans, believe it or not, colonised New Guinea, Marshall Islands, and a few of the other smaller islands in the Pacific. So you had this issue where each state had its own military. And interestingly, in 1885, believe it or not, 770 troops from New South Wales were sent to Sudan to reclaim Sudan from the Marji, which was the local revolt which threw the British out in and saw the destruction of physical destruction of General Gordon. And if any of you find yourself in the CBD in Melbourne, and you go to the Treasury building, not Parliament House, but between the Treasury building and Parliament House, you will see one of the biggest statues in this state dedicated to the loser General Gordon. So in 1885, sorry, 1887, I think they were sent. 85, they were sent there. So you had these issues. You had these colonies, and they had these issues. You had a growing labour movement. You had the shearers' strike. You had the maritime strike. You had the evolution of the trade union movement. You had a suffragette movement, which was gaining its feet, which meant that the women in South Australia were the first women in the world to get the vote in 1894, and the women of West Australia 2 or 3 years later. So you had these colonies which had the option of going it alone as independent nation states, as we see in Europe today, or federating. And from the early 1880s, there was a push to federate the colonies, not because of values or aspirations, but because it seemed to be the logical thing to do in terms of being able to mount effective defence against external aggression, the fact to limit immigration, and the fact that you get rid of customs and duties between states. But there was a lot of resistance to the idea of federation, especially from New South Wales, which saw the rest of Australia as total losers. Right? They wanted a handout. They needed support because the other colonies, in comparison in terms of population size, were relatively small in comparison to New South Wales. So I think it was in 1889, I'll use the word Sir Henry Parkes, who was the Premier of New South Wales, gave the famous Tenterfield Address. And the Tenterfield Address was about forming one nation on the continent. Being the Premier of New South Wales, he had a bit of push. And what happened is at the Premiers' Conference in 1890, when all the Premiers came together, they agreed to have a convention in 1891 to formalise some type of constitutional arrangement which looked at immigration, defence, customs and duties. Now, unfortunately, the rabble, the ordinary folk, people like you and me, people like you today, were a little bit unhappy about this happening from up high. And in 1893, the Riverina Leagues, which were the associations of people on either side of the Murray, had the famous People's Convention in 1893, which is called the Cowra Convention at Cowra. It was only a short convention, 2 or 3 days, but they made 2 exceptionally important decisions. The first decision is that they didn't accept the 1891 proposal by the premiers. They wanted a convention of delegates, and the delegates would have to be elected by the different states. And they wanted, after the delegates had formulated a constitution, they wanted the constitution to be put to each state in a referendum. So this is revolutionary, because if you look at society in Australia in the 1890s, it was a revolutionary society in terms of workers' rights, in terms of the ability to strike, in terms of the suffrage movement. This was the first time in human history that a constitution would have to be put to the people it affected. Okay? So, 2 years later, the premiers, realising they were on a losing horse because of the Cowra Convention, endorsed the 2 major principles of the Cowra People's Convention, that they would elect delegates and hold a series of conventions to formulate the Australian Constitution, and then those delegates would put the finalised constitution would be put to each state for ratification. Okay? So it seems to be a highly democratic process at this stage. There was only one issue. The problem was that the people who were able to vote to elect delegates were limited. In certain states, people of colour couldn't vote. In most states, except West Australia and South Australia, women couldn't vote. In some places, there were still property qualifications. But at the same time, in 1890, once the premiers agreed to hold a constitutional convention based on delegates, and don't forget, this is nothing new. In 1999, there was a constitutional convention in 1999 in this country, and I stood on a ticket of a new constitution for a new millennium, and guess what? I received about 0.1% of the vote, 5,000 people. But I'm just telling you, this idea of going to the people to elect delegates to sort out major issues is nothing new. It was something which was people expected. So the problem was that some states had a problem actually passing legislation to enable delegates to be elected. So the Queensland didn't get any legislation through to elect delegates, and West Australia Parliament made the decision that it would appoint the 10 delegates that would be sent to the 1897 Constitutional Convention. So when the Constitutional Convention was held in 1897, you had 10 delegates from Tasmania, 10 from New South Wales, 10 from Victoria, 10 from South Australia, all elected. None from Queensland, because they couldn't make up their minds whether they were going to have delegates or not, and 10 appointed by the West Australian government. So you had the first Constitutional Convention in 1897. Queensland wasn't represented. Then they had a big break because people wanted to go, the premiers wanted to go to Britain to celebrate the Diamond Jubilee of Queen Victoria, something you do as a premier. And they had a second convention in 1897. Again, Queensland wasn't represented. The major convention, which was held at the beginning of 1898, from the middle of January to the middle of March, so that's for 2 months, you had 60 delegates going point by point through a constitution which had been initially written by Samuel Griffiths, the Premier of Queensland in the 1890s, making changes. There was only one problem. The delegates didn't really, although there was the opportunity to represent the people of Australia, they didn't represent the people of Australia because only about the vote was voluntary to elect delegates. The trade union movement was split on whether they wanted to federate or not. There were all these voting restrictions. So the delegates that were elected were all men, but they reflected the interests of business and people in authority. There was only one delegate elected from the Labor movement, because the Labor movement was divided, although it said it put in candidates to be elected as delegates, and they had there was a strong Labor Party at that particular point in time, which was emerged from the failed Shearer strike and maritime strikes. The people that were elected to formulate the Constitution were basically the same people, the same type of people. And if you look at the pictures, you can see that. So here we have these 60 people have come together, 50 elected, 10 appointed from the West Australian government to formulate this Constitution. And the beauty about the Australian Constitution was that it was devoid of values, it was devoid of aspirations, and it was devoid of rights. It's a little bit like having an omelette for breakfast and not putting in tomatoes, onions, sausage or whatever. Because there's a very plain, boring omelette. But the interesting thing is, remember, it was 10 delegates from each state. Because people understood that irrespective of the population of the state, you needed to have the approval of the people of that state in order to federate. So if you gave a smaller state like Tasmania reduced representation, you wouldn't have federation. And that's why today we have a Senate, which is not based on population, but based on an equal division of 12 senators for each state. So getting back to the right. So here we have this beautiful constitution. Everybody, all the delegates have agreed on it. It's devoid of rights, values and aspirations. It's put to the Australian. Each state puts the constitution to the Australian people. The first thing is voting is not compulsory. So many people ignore it. The second thing is the Labor movement ignores the constitution, the federation, the referendum, because it thinks it's not democratic enough. So it kind of semi-boycotts it. The women's movement had failed to include female suffrage in the constitutional document, although they asked it to be included in 1897. So you've got this constitution, which is basically about customs, excise, immigration, and defence. Things that don't really have much effect, people think, on their day-to-day lives. So when the referendum was put to the smaller states, people overwhelmingly voted to federate. So 95% of Tasmanians who were able to vote voted to federate. Over 90% of Victorians voted to federate. That's about... In New South Wales, they rejected the Constitution. They said no. Because New South Wales government, in their wisdom, when they enacted the referendum bill, said that you needed 80,000 people to vote for federation before it's accepted. So what did the New South Wales government do? It changed it to a simple majority. So when the following year, in 1899, it was put to the people of New South Wales, a narrow majority, about 55%, voted to federate. Queensland was only about 55%. And guess what? West Australia had not made a decision about joining the federation. But the other premier said, "Fuck this," and they went off to London to the British Parliament. They said, "This is what we want." They made it. They tweaked some changes to the original referendum, like an appeal to the Privy Council, and Queen Victoria, on the 9th of July, 1900, signed off on the Australian Constitution. So if you are ever at a Trivial Pursuit night and somebody asks you about the preamble to the Australian Constitution, and they ask you who's not represented in the preamble, forget about First Nations people. Everybody knows that. But West Australia is not in the preamble to the Australian Constitution because they didn't have their referendum till the 30th of July, 1900. So, and it was a 70% for and 30 against. And what was the problem with West Australia? Well, you have two groups. Because in all these discussions, remember, there is no discussion about Indigenous people. There's no discussion about people of colour. No discussion whatsoever. No discussion about women. No discussion about the labour movement. The problem was in West Australia, you had the sand gropers, which were the original colonisers and squatters, which numbered about 50,000. And then you had about 150,000 miners that rushed to the Kalgoorlie and Coolgardie coalfields in the 1890s. So there was this struggles of the government of the day trying to disenfranchise males who were on the goldfields. So it wasn't until that was resolved. So at the last moment, West Australia was incorporated into the Australian Constitution. Now, a little few interesting sidelines. Now, I don't know how many of you know of the rascal, the Governor, Lord Hopetoun. Lord Hopetoun was a real character. I think they used to call him, what they used to call him in those days? Study finesse. He was a scoundrel, all right? A lord but a scoundrel with a sense of humour. Now, he was the Governor of Victoria who befriended Chummy Fleming, the anarchist activist, and he gave Chummy Fleming money to buy a property at 6 Argyle Street in Carlton, behind a 7-Eleven shop, which now doesn't exist. He also provided, when he left as Governor of Victoria, he provided the unemployed with 6 dozen bottles of the best French champagne and 5 shillings for every married man and 2 and 6 for every single man to, put it up to the Victorian government at that particular point in time. Now, for some, because he was here, and they thought it would be cheap to hire Lord Hopetoun, he was made Governor-General of Australia. He was Australia's first Governor-General. And him and Hollingworth, Governor-General Hollingworth, have one thing in common. No, they're not both accused of irredeemable acts.
So not that.
No, not that link. Not that link. But he was a real lad. He gave away his library, and I spoke about this last time, to a little town a little prison in the middle of the Northern Territory, 3,000 books. Buralua, yeah. People would go there and take out a book and go off for 6 months and come back after shearing and get another book. But he also appointed Australia's first Prime Minister before the election in 1901, because that was, as Governor-General, that was his role. And what did he do to annoy the Bunyip aristocracy that had created the Constitution? What did he do? He appointed the Premier of New South Wales, William Lyne, as the Prime Minister. But guess what? William Lyne was a prominent anti-billeter, because when you were voting in the referendum, you're either a billeter, which means you supported the referendum, or you're an anti-billeter, you're against the bill, right? These were the two factions. So he appointed one of the most prominent anti-federation people as Prime Minister. Now, there was a revolt, and even William Lyne realised he was being played as a fool, and he refused to take up the position, and Edmund Barton, who was one of the preeminent names in the formulation of the Australian Constitution, became the first Prime Minister. Now, I know you're all a little bit disgusted and concerned about those gentlemen in their black masks who wander around these days in the back streets and back lanes of Australia's capital cities, including Ballarat, wanting a white Australia. Now, I'd like to remind you they were the backbone of Australia in 1900, because one of the main issues was immigration. And it was quite the policy at that particular point in time was about not adulterating the white racist blood by black immigration. And although states had passed anti-Chinese legislation, the Commonwealth government, when it was formed in 1901, went one step further, and its first legislation off the bat was the creation of the White Australia policy. One person in Parliament voted against it. It was a universal concept that we were going to be, well, Australia, not we, but Australia was going to be a white bastion in a coloured, a heartland. Well, they have now. It took a long time, but they were good for about 70 years. People talk about the famous dictation test. Well, the dictation test, this is all with the Federation debate. The dictation test was introduced in New South Wales in 1898 to prevent people from the Commonwealth of colour entering Australia. Because before Federation, anybody from any part of the Commonwealth could go to any part of the Commonwealth they wanted to. And that's why, if you look at early Australian history, there are people of colour in that historical record, like John Joseph, one of the people who was tried for high treason because of his involvement in the Eureka Rebellion. He was a free black slave from New York. You had many people from the West Indies who would come here to find gold. There was no restriction. There was no passport, so there was no restriction on Commonwealth citizens moving around the Commonwealth Empire. So, customs and duties. Well, if you look at the Australian Constitution in 128 sections, it's fascinating. Because it is one of the most important. You would think after 10 years of discussion, 3 major conventions, people's conventions, there was one in 1896 again in Bathurst, to keep on the straight line, referendums, electing delegates, you would think that we would come up with something which was substantial. The problem is this isn't just a little story about history. Because the Australian Constitution, whether you like it or not, you may call yourself a sovereign citizen, you don't, recognise the state. But the Australian Constitution regulates every aspect of our existence in the legislative framework in this country. It regulates, and we saw this during COVID, how powerful the states can be in terms of restricting travel and placing restrictions on people. It regulates almost every aspect of our existence. But there is only one problem. The Australian Constitution overrides common law, English common law, British common law. So if you've got a document which basically is about regulating the relationship between the central government and the power that it is able to exercise and the state governments, and you have no protection for the individual, you have a very serious situation. Now, irrespective of how, the buffooning Washington carries on, at least in the United States Constitution, there are some protections. But in the Australian Constitution, I'm sick and tired of seeing people get up and say, he's infringing, they're infringing on my freedom of speech, my freedom to demonstrate, my freedom to freely associate. There are only 4 freedoms in the Australian Constitution. A limited freedom of religion, a freedom for descend the castle, just compensation if your land or property is acquired by the state. There's been an interesting case in Native Title Tribunal where a particular clan, I've forgotten their name, had their native title rescinded and they've won in the High Court for compensation because that is property. It's a property right. Then you've got, I love this one, you have the freedom not to be discriminated against because of the state you live in. So if you call me a bloody Queenslander and I've been here for 40 years, I can take you to the High Court and have you prosecuted. And you've also got the freedom to be tried by jury for a culpable offence, indictable offence. That's it. 25 years ago, the Australian High Court had to find an implied right to freedom of speech in the Constitution because you couldn't hold an election without freedom of speech. But that implied right only exists during the election campaign, the period where the election is called and the period when the election, the result is finalised. That is the only time. We are the only Western nation where there is no protection for the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. And this is a direct consequence of our constitutional arrangements. We had to have a referendum in 1967, which wasn't about counting Aboriginal people in the Senate, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. It was about giving the Commonwealth the power to pass legislation in terms of Indigenous Australians. Because before that, there was nothing the Commonwealth could do to assist First Nations people. Nothing in the Constitution. So when I stood in 1999 during the Constitutional Convention, saying we need a new Constitution for a new, 1,000 years, the result was infinitesimal, minuscule for that idea. Now, the only other problem with the Australian Constitution, which people don't seem to understand, is that your common law rights can be overridden by parliamentary legislation. For example, after 9/11, what we saw is a slew of legislation which we're now seeing enacted in Britain regarding Palestine action, which gives the state the power to ban any, or gives the Attorney General the power to ban any organisation at any particular time because he or she believes they may pose a threat to Commonwealth interests. Not a physical threat, but a threat to Commonwealth interests. So you see people spray painting some jets, and now it's a terrorist organisation in Great Britain. But they have an appeal to the High Court. We don't have that. They have appealed to the Privy Council or Supreme Court. We don't have that appeal. The High Court found a number of years ago that asylum seekers could be held indefinitely without charge as far as our constitutional arrangements are concerned. Now, currently we are just a minuscule, inconsequential minority, marginalised minority. But if for some reason we became some type of threat to the authorities, overnight, and we saw this when I spoke about the industrial workers of the world during World War I, overnight legislation can be passed. No, you don't even need it. The legislation is there. Overnight, that organisation can be banned. And if you continue to be a member of that organisation, you can be jailed for up to 25 years. And if you raise money for that organisation, you can be jailed for up to 25 years. So it's draconian legislation, which gives us no protection. Now, it's all very well to say that the state will never use that legislation. But in times when there may be pressure on the state, the legislation is there, can be enacted. You look suspicious to me. You've got dark glasses on. You could walk out of that door. You could be swept up into a little black Mariah, held secretly. This is legally. Oh, just a black little car.
Black van.
A black van, right? Yeah. Right. We could, the special branch, or ASIO, they haven't got a special branch, ASIO, would interrogate you secretly for 10 days. If you refuse to answer questions, you can be jailed for up to 10 years. You know why? Because you inadvertently may have information that may assist the authorities in their inquiries. And then when they throw you back out on the street without a bus ticket, you can't tell your partner or your kids where you've been. Or you can be jailed for up to 7 years. And it happened to an Indian doctor a few years ago. Remember the doctor? Yeah, then when they pulled him off the street, bang, legislation is there. So all I'm saying is, what's the point of having a constitution which basically is about regulating trade, regulating how much power each division of government is able to exercise? But the problem is in Australia, it's compounded by the problem that it's almost impossible to change the Australian Constitution for a variety of reasons. We've had, I think, 89 or 90 attempts and 9 have succeeded. Because the only people that can call a referendum is a political party that has a majority in both houses of Parliament, and then they can construct the referendum question in any way they like, as we saw from Mr. Howard with the head of state referendum in 1999. The way it was constructed, they were able to divide the opposition into two separate groups, and the monarchy continued to exist. You cannot, the people have no mechanism, as they do in Switzerland and in some American states, of actually initiating a referendum on a particular topic. 2 years ago, there was a referendum in Switzerland that was put up, which was put up by the people to abolish the Swiss armed forces. It lost, but it was put up. So if they get enough people saying we want this looked at, it's put up. So when you have a constitution which is impossible to change, which gives the government of the day extraordinary powers, it becomes dangerous. So our founding fathers, they were fathers, they weren't any mothers, but our founding fathers basically failed us as individuals and as groups because they didn't give us freedom of association, they didn't give us freedom of speech, they didn't give us, other freedoms. It's not there. That's why you can ban striking in Australia. Striking outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period is a criminal offence. That's right. If you take, you don't want to bankrupt the union. What you do is you find the individual, and it's happened in West Australia during the meat strike about 20 years ago. It was a construction strike. Certain workers were fined $10,000 a day. So if you're a worker and you're paying off a mortgage and you face a $10,000 fine, what are you going to do? There's no right to strike. The only rights we have in Australia, I know it sounds melodramatic, are the rights the government of the day is willing to provide for us. And they can be removed overnight. And the tragedy is there is legislation in place which can do that, and we've seen this happen before. We saw it during World War I, during the anti-conscription movement and the industrial workers of the world. So, thank you, founding fathers. So, the first... And guess what we did at the end of 1901? We passed legislation to send Australian troops to fight in the Boer War. It was very nice. And it goes on and on.
We're hardly a nation.
Or a federation of disparate groups. So all the followers bloody Tasmanians. 500,000 people with 12 senators. I don't know. No wonder they voted 95% for federation. The New South Wales people were right for all the luxuries. But I'll tell you a little funny aside before I finish. Now, the people of West Australia had buyer's regret, right? Because they joined federation after, at the end. So in 1931, could have been 33 then.
Still trying to get out.
Yes, they had a referendum. Where they voted to secede, which I think, very fair on their part. They've got a lot of minerals. They voted to secede from Australia, right? The rest of Australia, under the Constitution, the rest of Australia can tell them to fuck off. You can't secede, right? Secede. Because there's all this special thing about seceding. So they went to the Privy Council. And it wasn't until 1986 that the Hawke-led Labor government removed the right of appeal to the Privy Council. So they go in 1933, they catch a ship, the Premier and his entourage, and they go down to the Privy Council and they say, we want to secede. And the Privy Council says, oh, sorry, boys. They said, why? They said, well, in 1931, we passed legislation which doesn't allow the British government to interfere in the local politics of its former colonies. Something they forgot in 1975. And so they told them to piss off. But see, so I'd just like to remind you that next month I'm going to actually do something that's controversial. I'm going to sing the praises of the Whitlam-led Labor government and look at all the reforms which were initiated in 4.5 years. and the profound impact they've had on Australian society 50 years later. Because the 11th of November marks the 50th anniversary of the dismissal of the Whitlam-led Labor government. We're going to have a rally or a picnic on the steps of the Victorian, picnic on the steps of the Victorian Parliament House. We're organised. Yeah. Midday, obviously. I think it's a Wednesday. So, but what I'm just saying is, I want to look at all the reforms, because people have forgotten how many reforms went through in 4 years. Just needs 4.5. 4.5.
Elected in December 72.
Yeah, and then they were re-elected.
Yeah, and chucked out in November 75. So
Yeah, 4 years.
74, almost 3 years.
So there's a lot of reforms which people have forgotten, which I want to go through. That's for the fourth next one. Any questions about the glorious Australian Constitution?
Yeah, when they about the fair compensation for statehood taken over land, they didn't consider the Aborigines in, did they?
No, there was
Because
no.
they weren't Australians.
They weren't in the Australian
That
Constitution.
always pisses me off. I mean, what was it, 96%?
That was the first referendum. Yes, which all that did is
And people could come over, like me,
yeah,
if I had wanted to. I mean, I'd
Yeah.
never been naturalised, but
yeah.
and call themselves Australians. That really pisses me off.
There was no acknowledgement whatsoever.
Because I thought they were going to die out.
Well, that's what they claim. They were trying to die them out. They're almost successful in Tasmania, but not fully. But the thing is, they were not acknowledged in the preamble. They were not acknowledged in the Constitution. It was up to the state governments to regulate, and they had vicious regulation in terms of the way they dealt with Indigenous people, because they were treated as a nation that had lost the war, basically. That's right, 4 and 4. Yeah. So you had men.
More like a noxious pest.
Yeah, vermin. So you had men who volunteered in World War One. I'll tell you a very sad story. A number of Aboriginal people volunteered to fight in the Boer War. And they were denied re-entry into Australia. This is a fact. Because they were black and the White Australia policy had been passed.
Oh, really?
There were Aboriginals that was communities that had to come back through New Zealand.
Yeah. These are people who fought. My late wife's father was a returned serviceman. He fought in Bougainville, nasty fighting, and he wasn't entitled to a war services home because he was, he was a Torres Strait Islander.
They had to move the grade from the south side in Townsville
Yeah, back to
because the vandals were vandalising the bloody thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I lived right in that area,
yeah.
and it pisses me off as well.
Well, Doug, you've reached an age where you shouldn't be pissed off.
Well, I don't
Could be
mind
dangerous to your
I
health.
don't mind being pissed off.
I won't tell you how old Doug is.
No, we won't talk about that.
No,
It's
I'm not thinking.
but he's old enough to be pissed off.
not very interesting.
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Yeah, according to my calendar, the 11th of November is a Tuesday.
Well, then it's a Tuesday. I'm sure your calendar's better than mine.
Don't turn up at day one.
I'll never turn up a day one. So you can put it on your website. You can tell people there's going to be a picnic to celebrate the achievements. Everybody has rallied the achievements of the Whitlam Labor government. Medicare, which used to call Medibank, universal health insurance, you name it, it's all there.
Vietnam War.
Well, that was actually finished by Billy McMahon, but what Whitlam did is let out the draft resistance. I think 2 days later or 3 days later. But, But again, what's the point of... Some people say it's wonderful having a constitution that nobody knows anything about because there's no litigation regarding whether you got rights or not under the constitution. It's black and white.
Yeah.
You know? And then other people complain that you get what you call you get the judges making up the law through their interpretation of the Constitution. I've forgotten what they call that.
Interpretation of the Constitution. So you're not talking about case law, you're talking about.
No, there's no case law. It's interpretation.
Okay.
The thing about being one of the 7 High Court judges is it's your job to interpret what is written down. No.
Oh, black letter law.
Black leather law.
All right.
You can have judges that are a little bit what they call a bit ambitious, and they kind of create law. Some people say that the Mabo decision in 1992 should never have occurred. It was only a 4-3 victory. It was a very small victory because terra nullius, them changing the concept of terra nullius that Australia belonged to no one before colonisation, was the judges making law, not Parliament. And that's why Parliament then passed legislation to water down the High Court judgment. And that's the beauty about Parliament. It supersedes the High Court. But the High Court can be adventurous in terms of its interpretation of the Constitution. But then Parliament can pass legislation to try to squash that. And that's why you've got all these disputes now between different Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups about who owns what, because of the bucket loads of extinguishment which were poured onto the Mabo decision in 1992. It's all right. You seem a bit shell-shocked.
I just like the creative interpretation.
And what do you think the second piece of Commonwealth legislation was after the introduction of the White Australia policy? Come on, colour. Remember colour? No, that was the first. The second one, second piece of legislation. Third one was sending the boys to the war. What was the second one? Come on, colour. No, you're Australian history. No, that was before that. That's old hat. That's been happening since 1855. No, the Kanak Deportation Act. Over 40,000 Kanaks have been brought across to do the work that white men couldn't do in the northern cane fields and the cane fields of New South Wales. And over 20,000 were deported. Some of them have been here 20 to 30 years. Deported back to the islands.
They weren't needed anymore.
No. We had the Italians coming in there, and the Greeks. They could do the work that the Southern Europeans could do the work. No, they were deported on the. You got to remember that the boys march around in their little black balaclavas. Worse was Australia. Apart from small groups like the Industrial Workers of the World, the anarchist, the Melbourne Anarchist Club, the great majority of organisations, including the labour movement, were based on the idea of a white Australia. So that's the essence.
2025. Here we go again. Ugly story.
Well, it could be life can be an ugly story, but what to me is the fact that something that was created during the last decade of the 19th century now continues to have a profound impact on us 125 years later. And unless the Constitution is suspended, maybe for revolutionary reasons or whatever, there's minimal chances of changing, as we saw with the referendum recently.
Yeah, it seems very cunning construction to me.
I just think people were just trying to create something which nobody had any objection to, so that all the states would come together as one.
I thought terra nullius was an extension of the British rule.
No.
Empty land.
No. Terra nullius means the land of no one. Every other colony in the British Commonwealth had come to some agreement, as in New Zealand, with the local inhabitants and formulated a treaty. No treaty was ever formulated in Australia, and the way that they claimed this reclaim the land is by introducing the legal concept of terra nullius, the land of no one, the land of no one,
Pretentious Latin phrase,
the land of no one, the land of no
I
one.
still,
meaning nothing.
Well, that did mean a lot to the indigenous, don't it?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know,
Yeah.
so
It's
it's a pretentious bit of Queensland.
The contrast I've heard is the US Constitution was created after a great societal upheaval. And the Australian one was not, it did not have that history. There wasn't the motivation or the lack of experience. Help kind of explain why it is so.
bland.
No, I remember learning about this when I was in year 12, high school. And the thing we were told to get into our heads, so we get a good pass and stuff is, there was this thing called Section 92, which was about the trade and intercourse between the states.
That's right.
Trade and intercourse between the states. The whole thing was a great thing.
Yeah,
And no with the rest of it.
that's right. They did have the option of including rights. They did have the option of including female suffrage. But there was one fascinating thing about female suffrage. Now, there is a section in the Constitution which says that the rights of people in one state in a federal system automatically become the rights of every other state. So although the founding fathers refused to introduce universal female suffrage into the Constitution, the fact that in 1894 and 1896 women obtained the vote in South Australia and Western Australia meant that not the first election, but the second election in 1903, which was based on the new Commonwealth electoral map, that women were allowed to vote across Australia because of that nominee. But again, you've got to remember that no Aboriginal people were allowed to vote anywhere, or any more people of colour. They're very nice biscuits, though. I'm pleased I used my teeth to open the
I've
bag.
been to the takeaway shop with the crowd.
Coconut, very nice. Any more questions?
How did they get away with it?
How they- Well, because of the type of people that are elected to the delegates. It was all about the delegates. Now, if the Australian people were not interested in federating for their own
I
reasons,
think that's another cunning thing about it. They made it so bloody boring. And people would think, oh, what fun.
but the good thing is, of the 620,000 people that voted in all the states, I think over 400,000 voted for federation. But mainly the bludgers in the smaller states wanting a handout from New South Wales. And they still got the same attitude, I think. People do. Sorry, anybody who listens to this, who sees this YouTube from New South Wales. You're not all bludgers.
They're not all bad.